The rain hammered against the stained glass windows as Colonel Marcus Whitfield pushed open the heavy wooden doors of St. Michael's Chapel. Behind him, 5 Confederate officers stumbled inside, their gray uniforms soaked through, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. They had been riding for 3 days straight, carrying dispatches that could change the course of the war in Virginia. Finally, "Some shelter?" Captain Henderson muttered, removing his waterlogged hat. "Thought we'd drown out there." The chapel was empty, or so it seemed. Rows of simple wooden pews stretched toward a modest altar, illuminated by the gray light filtering through the windows. A single brass cross gleamed in the dimness. Everything appeared peaceful, abandoned, forgotten by the war that raged just miles away. Colonel Whitfield walked slowly down the center aisle, his boots echoing on the stone floor. Something felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy. But exhaustion clouded his judgment. His men needed rest, and this house of God seemed like the safest place for miles. "We'll wait here until the storm passes," he announced. "Post a watch at the door. The rest of you get some rest." As his officers settled into the pews, none of them noticed the fresh scratches on the floorboards. None of them saw the nearly invisible seams where the seats had been carefully removed and replaced. And none of them suspected that beneath their very feet lay enough Union rifles to arm an entire company, or that the Northern soldiers who had hidden them there were watching from the woods outside, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. If you're fascinated by untold stories from the Civil War, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We dive deep into the hidden moments that shaped American history. Drop a comment below telling us which Civil War mystery you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy this story, give us a thumbs up. It helps us bring you more incredible historical content. Chapter 1. The Refuge. The storm that swept through Shenandoah Valley that October morning in 1862 came without warning, as if God himself had decided to wash the blood from the land. Colonel Marcus Whitfield had seen many storms during his 38 years, but few as violent as this. Lightning split the sky in jagged white scars, and thunder rolled across the mountains like artillery fire. His small detachment, just 5 officers and himself, had been riding since dawn, carrying sealed orders from General Lee's headquarters in Richmond. The dispatches were critical. Troop movements, supply routes, intelligence about Union positions. If they fell into enemy hands, it could spell disaster for the Confederate forces in the region. "Colonel, we need to find shelter!" Lieutenant Morrison shouted over the roar of wind and rain. The young officer was barely 23, fresh from the battles at Antietam, where he'd watched half his company cut down in a single afternoon. His hands trembled on the reins, though whether from cold or memories, Whitfield couldn't tell. Through the sheets of rain, Whitfield spotted the chapel's white steeple rising above a grove of oak trees. St. Michael's Chapel. He remembered it from before the war, a small Protestant church that served the scattered farming families in this part of the valley. It stood isolated, a quarter-mile from the nearest road, accessible only by a muddy track that wound through the trees. "There!" he pointed. "We'll take shelter in the church." They urged their exhausted horses forward, hooves splashing through puddles that had formed in minutes. As they approached, Whitfield noticed details that should have alarmed him. The grass around the chapel had been trampled recently, the ground showing signs of heavy traffic. The building's door hung slightly ajar, unusual for an abandoned structure, but the rain was blinding and his men were at their limit. Captain James Henderson, his oldest friend, was burning with fever. Probably pneumonia, contracted after they'd forded the Rapidan River 2 days earlier. They needed rest and warmth, even if only for a few hours. Whitfield dismounted and led his horse to the small stable behind the chapel. The structure was empty but showed signs of recent use. Fresh hay scattered on the ground, water buckets that hadn't yet collected dust. Someone had been here, and recently. "Colonel?" Sergeant Davis appeared at his elbow, his scarred face creased with concern. Davis was a veteran of the Mexican War, a man who'd survived more battles than most soldiers ever saw. His instincts had kept him alive this long. Something ain't right about this place. I know, Whitfield admitted quietly. But look at Henderson. He won't make another mile. We'll rest here, post guards, and move on when the storm breaks. They secured the horses and entered through the chapel's rear door. Inside, the temperature was only marginally warmer, but at least it was dry. The interior was simple. 2 rows of wooden pews facing a raised platform with a lectern and altar. Whit flags hung limply from the rafters, and a layer of dust covered most surfaces, except the floor, which appeared to have been recently swept. Lieutenant Morrison immediately collapsed into a front pew, his head falling back against the wood. "Thank God," he whispered. "Just an hour's rest. That's all I need." Captain Henderson stumbled to a pew near the center, his face flushed with fever. He was shivering despite his heavy wool coat. Whitfield helped him lie down, using a rolled saddle blanket as a pillow. "Stay with him," Whitfield told young Corporal Williams, barely 18 years old. The boy had lied about his age to enlist, following his father and 2 brothers into Lee's army. Only he had survived. "Keep him warm. If the fever worsens, call me." The colonel walked slowly down the center aisle, his boots leaving wet prints on the stone floor. His military mind was cataloging everything. The 6 windows, 3 on each side, the single door at the front, the rear entrance they'd used, the choir loft above, empty except for shadows. That's when he noticed the pews. They were well-made, solid oak construction, but something about them seemed off. The wood grain didn't quite match on some of the seats. There were small gaps along some of the edges, barely visible unless you looked closely. And those scratches on the floor, they formed patterns, as if heavy objects had been dragged repeatedly across the stone. Whitfield knelt down, running his hand along the base of one pew. His fingers found a small metal catch, cunningly concealed in the decorative carving. He froze. "Sergeant Davis!" he called softly. "Come look at this." But before Davis could respond, the sound of horses reached them from outside. Multiple horses, moving at a walk through the storm. The Confederate officers tensed, hands moving to their weapons. Through the rain-streaked windows, Whitfield saw movement in the trees. Gray uniforms, or were they blue? In this light, with the rain distorting everything, it was impossible to tell. The riders passed by without stopping, disappearing back into the storm, but their presence had confirmed Whitfield's suspicions. This area wasn't as deserted as it appeared. They were being watched. He stood and addressed his men. "Get what rest you can, but stay alert. We move out the moment this storm eases." As his officers settled in, trying to find comfortable positions on the hard wooden pews, none of them realized they were sitting on a powder keg. Beneath those carefully crafted seats, hidden in compartments that had taken Union sympathizers weeks to construct, lay 53 Springfield rifles, 4,000 rounds of ammunition, and detailed maps of Confederate positions throughout the valley. The trap had been set weeks ago. The hunters had been waiting patiently, and now, exhausted and seeking shelter from the storm, the Confederate officers had walked right into it. Outside, hidden in the tree line, Union Captain Daniel Foster lowered his spyglass and smiled. Chapter 2. The Hidden Arsenal. 3 weeks earlier, Captain Daniel Foster of the 5th New York Volunteer Infantry had received orders that seemed impossible. Establish a weapons cache behind Confederate lines in the heart of the Shenandoah Valley. The rifles were needed for Union sympathizers in the area, farmers and townspeople who secretly supported the North but lived under Confederate occupation. Foster was 31, a former schoolteacher from Albany, who'd enlisted the day after Fort Sumter fell. He was slight of build, with wire-rimmed spectacles that made him look more like a clerk than a soldier. But appearances were deceiving. Foster had a brilliant tactical mind and an absolute fearlessness that had earned him rapid promotion. His commanding officer, Colonel Thomas Kane, had been blunt during the briefing. "The valley is the breadbasket of the Confederacy. If we can arm local Unionists, they can disrupt supply lines, provide intelligence, and generally make life hell for Lee's army. But we can't just drop rifles on people's doorsteps. We need a secure, hidden depot." "Why not use a barn or a cave?" Foster had asked. "Too obvious. The Confederates search those regularly. We need something they'd never suspect. Somewhere they'd consider sacred, inviolable." Kane had smiled grimly. "We need a church." St. Michael's Chapel had been perfect. The building stood on land owned by the Reverend Samuel Hartwick, a 60-year-old minister whose son had been killed fighting for the Union at Bull Run. Hartwick's grief had transformed into quiet, burning determination. When Foster approached him through intermediaries, the old minister hadn't hesitated. "Use my church," Hartwick had said. "Use it to strike back at those who tore this nation apart." The operation had taken 12 nights of dangerous work. Foster and a hand-picked team of 6 men had moved in darkness, transporting rifles from a Union supply depot 30 miles away. They traveled in small groups, disguised as farmers, using back roads and creek beds to avoid Confederate patrols. The engineering challenge had been significant. They couldn't simply pile rifles under the pews. Any serious search would find them immediately. They needed something more sophisticated. Private Lucas Brennan, a carpenter from Pennsylvania, had designed the solution. The pews would be converted into hidden compartments. The seats would lift up on concealed hinges, revealing storage spaces beneath. The rifles would be wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust and damage, then carefully arranged in custom-built racks inside each compartment. "The trick," Brennan explained as they worked by lantern light, "is making it look natural. The pews have to function normally, feel right when someone sits on them. No hollow sounds, no suspicious gaps." They'd worked meticulously. Each pew was carefully disassembled, modified, and reassembled. The seats were weighted with sandbags to maintain their normal feel. The hinges were German-made precision instruments, nearly silent in operation. The catches that held the seats closed were disguised as decorative elements in the wood carving. Reverend Hartwick had watched them work, his weathered face impassive. On the final night, as they loaded the last rifles into place, he'd spoken quietly. "My son died at Bull Run. He was 24 years old. He wrote to me the night before the battle, said he was fighting to preserve the Union, to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Those were President Lincoln's words, and Samuel believed them with his whole heart. Foster had nodded, unsure what to say. "I'm a man of God," Hartwick continued. "I've preached peace and forgiveness for 40 years. But what they've done, tearing our nation apart, destroying families, spilling brothers' blood, this cannot stand. If hiding weapons in my church helps end this war, then so be it. The Lord will judge me." They'd finished just before dawn on September 22nd. 53 rifles carefully hidden, 4,000 rounds of ammunition, maps showing Confederate supply depots, troop concentrations, and defensive positions, intelligence gathered by Union sympathizers over months of careful observation. The plan was elegant. Local Unionists would come to the chapel for prayer services. Reverend Hartwick would admit them 1 or 2 at a time. They'd retrieve rifles from the pews, hide them under their coats, and slip away. Slowly, quietly, the Valley's underground Union supporters would be armed, but Foster had insisted on one additional element, a contingency plan. "What if Confederate troops stumble onto this place?" he'd asked Kane. "What if they decide to use it as a headquarters or shelter?" "Then we lose the rifles," Kane had replied. "No," Foster had shaken his head. "Then we turn it into a trap." He'd positioned a squad of sharpshooters in the woods surrounding the chapel. men who would remain hidden and watch for any Confederate activity. If Southern troops entered the building, Foster's men would observe, wait, and look for an opportunity. An opportunity for what? Kane had asked. To capture them, to recover intelligence, maybe even to capture officers carrying orders. Foster had smiled coldly. A church is a sanctuary, but it can also be a prison if you control the doors. For 3 weeks, Foster's men had waited. They'd watched Confederate patrols pass by. They'd seen local farmers come to worship. They'd observed Reverend Hartwick going about his duties, never betraying by word or gesture what his church now contained. And then, on that stormy October morning, they'd watched 6 Confederate officers ride up to the chapel and go inside. Foster had been checking snares for rabbits when his sentinel, Corporal Hayes, had come running through the woods. "Captain! Rebels in the chapel! 6 of them, officers by the look of it!" Foster had grabbed his spyglass and moved to an observation point. Through the rain, he'd watched the Confederates stable their horses and enter the building. His practiced eye had noted details: the quality of their uniforms, the way they moved, the fact that one officer seemed to be in command while the others deferred to him. "Field-grade officers," he muttered. "Maybe carrying dispatches." Sergeant William Cobb, a grizzled 40-year-old from Vermont, had crawled up beside him. "We could hit them now, sir. 6 against 7. We've got the advantage." "No," Foster said thoughtfully. "They're exhausted, sick. One of them has fever. They're not going anywhere in this storm. We wait, we watch, we pick our moment. What if they find the rifles? Then we attack immediately. But I don't think they will. They're looking for shelter, not weapons. People see what they expect to see." As the hours passed and the storm continued its assault on the valley, Foster's mind raced through possibilities. The Confederate officers were trapped by weather and exhaustion. His men had them surrounded, but the situation was delicate. A firefight in or around the chapel could damage the hidden weapons, alert other Confederate units in the area, or result in casualties Foster couldn't afford. No, this required finesse. This required patience, and this required understanding exactly who these Confederate officers were and what they were carrying. As darkness began to fall and the storm showed no signs of weakening, Foster made his decision. He would wait until full night, then personally infiltrate the chapel. He would listen, observe, and gather intelligence. And when the moment was right, when he understood the full opportunity before him, he would strike. But he would have to be careful, because if that Confederate colonel examining the Pews discovered the hidden compartment, everything would unravel in seconds. Chapter 3. The long night inside St. Michael's Chapel, Colonel Marcus Whitfield couldn't sleep. He lay on a hard wooden pew near the altar, staring up at the ceiling beams barely visible in the darkness. Outside, the storm had settled into a steady drumming rain. His men were scattered throughout the chapel, most of them finally sleeping after days of hard riding. Captain Henderson's fever had worsened. The man was delirious now, mumbling names of soldiers who died at Sharpsburg. Corporal Williams sat beside him, occasionally pressing a wet cloth to his forehead, the best they could do with limited supplies. Whitfield's mind kept returning to that metal catch he'd found on the pew. He'd examined it more closely after the patrol passed by, confirming his suspicions. The pews had been modified, and recently, but for what purpose? His first thought had been documents. Perhaps Union sympathizers were using the chapel to pass messages. But the construction seemed too elaborate for paper. The compartments, if that's what they were, appeared large enough for weapons. The realization had come gradually, pieces falling into place. The fresh hay in the stable, the swept floor, the careful construction of the pews. This wasn't a random hiding place. It was an arsenal, built with skill and planning. But whose arsenal? Union sympathizers in the valley, Northern agents operating behind Confederate lines, or something more organized? Whitfield sat up slowly, careful not to wake Lieutenant Morrison in the next pew. He needed to know what was hidden here. If there were weapons cached in this chapel, he needed to secure them. Such a find could be invaluable, not the weapons themselves necessarily, but the intelligence about who had placed them here and why. He moved quietly down the aisle, counting pews. 12 on each side, 24 total. If each contained weapons, this was a significant operation. He chose a pew near the back, far from his sleeping men, and examined it closely by the dim light filtering through the windows. His fingers found the catch. He pressed it gently, and with a soft click, the seat lifted slightly. His heart racing, Whitfield raised it further. The compartment was empty. He stood frozen, confused. Why build an elaborate hiding place and leave it empty? Unless the weapons had already been distributed, or unless this particular pew had already been emptied. He tried another pew. Empty. A third. Empty. Then he tried one near the front, and the seat wouldn't budge, locked or sealed somehow. He moved to the pew beside it. Same result, and the next. Whitfield's tactical mind raced. Some pews were empty, their contents already removed. Others remained sealed. Someone was in the process of distributing whatever was hidden here, which meant this operation was active, ongoing, which meant he and his men were in even more danger than he'd realized. A sound from outside froze him in place. Not rain, not wind. Footsteps. Careful, deliberate footsteps circling the chapel. Whitfield drew his revolver and moved silently to the nearest window. He peered out into the darkness but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, moving from the front of the building toward the rear. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. He moved quickly to where Sergeant Davis lay sleeping and shook him awake. The older man came alert instantly, years of military training overriding exhaustion. "We're being watched," Whitfield whispered. "Someone outside." Maybe more than one. Davis nodded grimly. "The patrol that passed earlier?" "Maybe. Or whoever's been using this chapel. Wake the others, quietly." Within minutes, all 5 of his officers were awake and armed. Even Captain Henderson, despite his fever, had his pistol drawn. They positioned themselves at different windows, watching the darkness. For long minutes, nothing moved. Then Lieutenant Morrison hissed softly, "There, in the trees, north side." Whitfield saw it, a shadow that moved wrong, too deliberate to be wind-blown branches. Then another shadow to the east, and a third to the west. "We're surrounded," Davis said quietly. "At least 3, probably more." Corporal Williams, his young face pale, asked, "Should we make a run for it? Try to reach the horses? In this darkness?" Whitfield shook his head. "We'd be cut down before we made it 20 feet. No, we stay here. Stone walls, good firing positions. This building is defensible." "Unless they burn us out," Davis noted. "They won't," Whitfield said with more confidence than he felt. "If they wanted us dead, they could have hit us when we first arrived. They're waiting for something." "For what?" Morrison asked. "I don't know. But until I figure it out, we hold this position." Outside, Captain Foster watched the chapel through his spyglass, cursing softly. The Confederate colonel was smart. He'd spotted the watchers and roused his men. The element of surprise was gone. Sergeant Cobb moved up beside him. "They know we're here, sir." "I can see that." Foster lowered the spyglass. "But they don't know how many we are or what we want. They're defensive, cautious." "We still have the advantage. We can wait them out." Foster nodded. "The storm will last through the night. By morning, they'll be desperate. No food, limited water, and one of them is sick. They'll have to make a move." "What if they find the rifles?" "Then we attack. But I don't think they will. That colonel is curious, but he's focused on the threat outside, not the threat beneath him." As if to confirm Foster's words, they watched through the windows as the Confederate officers took up defensive positions. Smart tactical placement, Foster noted approvingly. This colonel knew his business. "What's the plan, sir?" Cobb asked. Foster thought for a moment. "We maintain surveillance through the night. If they try to leave, we intercept them. If they stay put, we approach under a flag of truce at first light." "Truce? Sir, with respect, we've got them trapped. Why negotiate?" "Because I want to know who they are and what they're carrying. Those men rode hard for days to reach this area. They're on a mission. If we can capture them and their dispatches without a fight, we gain intelligence. If we're forced to kill them, we might never know what information they were carrying." Cobb looked skeptical but nodded. "And if they won't surrender? Then we find out what it takes to break a defensive position held by 6 determined men." Foster smiled grimly. "I'd rather avoid that. Urban fighting is unpredictable, even in a building this small." Inside the chapel, the hours crawled past. Whitfield kept his men rotating watch positions, ensuring no one fell asleep at their post. Captain Henderson's condition worsened. His fever dreams became louder, more agitated. They had to muffle his voice to prevent him from alerting whoever waited outside. Around midnight, Whitfield made a decision. He gathered his officers near the altar, speaking in whispers. "We can't stay here indefinitely. By morning, Henderson will need a doctor. We're low on water and have no food. Whatever's happening here, we're caught in the middle of it." "We could send someone for help," Lieutenant Morrison suggested. "Slip out the back, make a run for Confederate lines." "Through those woods? At night? With watchers surrounding us?" Whitfield shook his head. "Suicide." "Then what?" Davis asked. Whitfield looked at each of them in turn. "We find out what's hidden in these pews. If there are weapons here, we take them. We use them as leverage to negotiate our way out." "Negotiate with who?" Williams asked. "We don't even know who's out there." "Yankees," Davis said with certainty. "Has to be. Nobody else would go to this much trouble." Whitfield nodded slowly. "Probably Union agents, which means they're not going to just let us walk away. They'll want their weapons back, and they'll want to silence anyone who knows about this location." The reality settled over them like a shroud. They were trapped in a chapel surrounded by enemy forces, sitting on top of a hidden arsenal with no clear way out. "So we fight," Morrison said simply. "Only as a last resort," Whitfield replied. "First, we gather intelligence. We find out exactly what's hidden here. Then we wait for an opportunity." He turned to Sergeant Davis. "You're with me. The rest of you maintain watch. If anything moves out there, call out quietly." Whitfield and Davis moved methodically through the chapel, testing each pew. They found the pattern. The front 8 pews on each side were still sealed. The rear 4 on each side had been emptied. Working carefully, they managed to open one of the sealed compartments. The rifles gleamed in the lantern light. Brand new Springfield Model 1861s still wrapped in oilcloth. Ammunition boxes beneath them. And something else, a waterproof case containing papers. Whitfield opened the case and began reading by lamplight. His face went pale. "What is it?" Davis whispered. "Maps," Whitfield said hoarsely. "Our positions, supply routes, defensive works around Richmond. This is detailed intelligence about Confederate operations throughout Virginia." "How did they—" "Spies. Has to be. This information is current, detailed. Someone has been gathering it for months." Davis's face hardened. "If this reaches Union commanders, it could cost us the war," Whitfield finished. He looked at the rifles, the ammunition, the intelligence documents. "This isn't just a weapons cache. It's a full espionage operation. And we've stumbled right into it." A sound from outside made them both freeze. Footsteps on the chapel steps. The front door handle rattled. Someone was trying to get in. Chapter 4. The Confrontation. Captain Daniel Foster stood on the chapel steps, his hand on the door handle, weighing his options. Dawn was still hours away, but he'd grown tired of waiting. The Confederate officers inside weren't going anywhere, and every hour increased the risk of other Southern troops discovering the situation. It was time to end this. He released the handle and stepped back, raising his voice to carry through the heavy wooden door. Confederate officers inside. This is Captain Daniel Foster, 5th New York Volunteer Infantry. You are surrounded and cut off from your lines. I'm here under a flag of truce to discuss terms. Silence from within. Then, after a long moment, a Southern accented voice replied, This is Colonel Marcus Whitfield, Army of Northern Virginia. State your terms. Foster smiled slightly. A colonel, that was good. Senior officers often carried valuable intelligence. Colonel, you and your men are trapped. My men have this chapel surrounded. You have no food, limited water, and I understand one of your officers is seriously ill. Surrender now, and I guarantee you'll be treated as prisoners of war under the rules of military courtesy. Another silence. Foster could imagine the discussion happening inside. Then Whitfield's voice came again, stronger this time. Captain Foster, I regret to inform you that we cannot surrender. We carry dispatches vital to the Confederate cause. However, I propose an alternative. Allow us free passage to our lines, and we will leave without violence. Foster shook his head, though Whitfield couldn't see it. Colonel, you know I can't do that. But I can offer you medical treatment for your sick officer and comfortable quarters until you can be exchanged. There's no shame in surrender when outnumbered and surrounded. Inside, Whitfield turned to his officers. They were gathered near the altar, rifles in hand, faces grim. He's right about Henderson, Lieutenant Morrison said quietly. The captain needs a doctor soon, or he won't make it. Whitfield looked at his old friend, now unconscious and burning with fever. They'd served together for 15 years, fought in Mexico, survived countless battles. The thought of losing him to disease in a forgotten chapel seemed unbearably cruel. But the documents he'd found changed everything. If those maps and intelligence reports reached Union hands, hundreds, maybe thousands, of Confederate soldiers would die. Supply lines would be cut. Defensive positions would be compromised. The entire Virginia campaign could collapse. We can't surrender, he said firmly. Not with what we know. Not with what's hidden here. Sergeant Davis nodded agreement. Those rifles and those documents are worth more than our lives. If the Yankees get them, they already have them, Corporal Williams pointed out. They're just sitting here under our feet. But they don't have the dispatches we're carrying, Whitfield replied. He pulled a sealed leather case from inside his coat. The orders from General Lee that had brought them here in the first place. Foster wants these. He wants to know what we know. If we surrender, he gets everything. And if we don't? Morrison asked. Whitfield walked to the front door and called out, Captain Foster, I appreciate your courtesy, but I must decline. We will defend this position. If you wish to avoid bloodshed, I suggest you withdraw. Outside, Foster closed his eyes in frustration. He'd hoped to avoid this. Sergeant Cobb moved up beside him, rifle ready. Your orders, sir, Foster thought quickly. A frontal assault would be costly. The chapel's stone walls provided excellent cover, and 6 determined men with good firing positions could hold off 3 times their number. But he couldn't just walk away. Those men inside had seen too much. We lay siege, he decided. Post men at all approaches. Nobody gets in or out. We wait. Eventually, hunger, thirst, or that sick officer will force them to reconsider. Could take days, Cobb noted. Then it takes days. But those men don't walk away with what they know. As dawn broke gray and cold over the Shenandoah Valley, the siege of St. Michael's Chapel began in earnest. Foster positioned his 7 men in a loose ring around the building, close enough to prevent escape, but far enough back to avoid being easy targets. Inside, Whitfield rationed their remaining water, 2 canteens between 6 men. No food except some hardtack in Davis's saddlebag. Captain Henderson was failing. His breathing had become shallow and labored. "We can't hold out long," Morrison said quietly, watching the Union positions through a window. 2 days at most, less if Henderson needs water. Whitfield knew he was right, but surrender wasn't an option, not when they carried intelligence that could save Confederate lives. There had to be another way. He moved through the chapel again, studying the hidden compartments. 16 pews still sealed, filled with rifles and ammunition. An idea began forming. "Sergeant Davis," he called quietly. "How many of these rifles do you think we could use?" Davis looked at the pews, understanding dawning. "All of them, if we had the men. But there's 6 of us, and one can't fight." "I'm not thinking about fighting," Whitfield said slowly. "I'm thinking about leverage." He explained his plan. It was desperate, maybe even mad, but it might be their only chance. Lieutenant Morrison listened, then nodded. "It could work. It's risky as hell, but it could work." "Then let's do it," Whitfield decided. "We move tonight." That afternoon, Foster noticed activity in the chapel, shadows moving past windows, sounds of things being moved. He raised his spyglass but couldn't make out details. "What are they doing in there?" Cobb wondered. "I don't know," Foster admitted, "but I don't like it." As darkness fell, Foster crept closer to the chapel, trying to see inside. What he glimpsed through a window made his blood run cold. The Confederate officers had discovered the hidden rifles. They weren't just defending the chapel anymore, they were fortifying it. He could see weapons being unpacked, ammunition being stacked, firing positions being prepared. "Sir," Cobb hissed from behind him, "they're turning our own arsenal against us." Foster pulled back, his mind racing. This changed everything. With that many weapons, the Confederates could hold the chapel indefinitely. They could even break out, fighting their way through his thin line with superior firepower. He gathered his men in a quick conference. "We have to move now, before they're fully prepared. A quick assault. Overwhelming force." "Sir, they've got 40, maybe 50 rifles in there now," one of his men protested. "Even half-loaded, they could cut us down." "Then we need a different approach," Foster said grimly. "We can't storm the building, but we can smoke them out." Sergeant Cobb's eyes widened. "Fire? Sir, that's a church." "It's also a weapons depot," Foster replied coldly. "And those men inside have intelligence that could help us win this war. If we can't capture them, we destroy what they've found and prevent them from reporting back." It was a brutal calculation, the kind war forced on men. Foster didn't like it, but he could see no alternative. "We move at midnight," he ordered. "Prepare torches." Me inside the chapel, Colonel Whitfield watched the Union positions and knew they were running out of time. The Yankees would assault soon, they had to. The only question was when and how. He'd armed his men with the captured rifles. They had ammunition for days of fighting. But ammunition wouldn't cure Henderson's fever or produce food and water. "Colonel," Morrison said urgently, "look, in the tree line. They're preparing something." Through the darkness, Whitfield saw movement, men carrying what looked like torches or lanterns. "Fire," he said flatly. "They're going to burn us out." The officers looked at each other, the reality sinking in. If the chapel burned, they'd be forced into the open. In the chaos and smoke, the Yankees could pick them off easily. And even if they survived, 40 rifles and all that intelligence would be destroyed, or worse, recovered by the enemy. "We're out of time," Davis said quietly. "We have to move now." Whitfield looked at his unconscious friend, at his exhausted officers, at the rifles they'd spent the day preparing. Then he looked at the sealed leather case containing Lee's dispatches, orders that needed to reach Confederate commanders. He made his decision. "All right," he said. "Here's what we do." As midnight approached and Foster's men moved into position with their torches, neither side knew that Reverend Samuel Hartwick was riding hard through the darkness, racing toward a Confederate cavalry patrol he'd spotted that afternoon. The old minister had watched his church become a battlefield. He'd seen men prepare to burn the building his grandfather had built a century ago, and he'd decided that enough was enough. Some things were worth more than winning. Some things had to be preserved, no matter which side prevailed. Chapter 5. The Midnight Move. The first torch flew through the darkness at exactly midnight, arcing toward the chapel's wooden door. But it never reached its target. A rifle shot cracked from the tree line, not from the chapel, but from the south. The torch spun away, falling harmlessly into the mud. Foster spun around, confused, as more shots erupted from the darkness behind his position. "We're being flanked!" Sergeant Cobb shouted. "Multiple shooters, south side!" Foster's mind raced. Impossible. There were no Confederate forces in this area. They'd scouted thoroughly, unless... The thunder of hooves answered his question. Through the rain and darkness came riders, gray uniforms, at least 20 of them, Confederate cavalry, sabers drawn, bearing down on Foster's exposed position. "Fall back!" Foster ordered. "Into the woods! Move!" His 7 men scattered, abandoning their assault positions and melting into the forest. The cavalry patrol pulled up at the chapel, surrounding it. An officer dismounted, a major. Foster saw through his spyglass from his new hiding spot 50 yards away. Inside the chapel, Colonel Whitfield heard the commotion and moved to the window. Confederate cavalry, reinforcements he hadn't expected and couldn't explain. The chapel door burst open. Major William Cassidy of the 7th Virginia Cavalry strode in, water streaming from his coat. He was in his 40s, with a thick mustache and hard eyes that had seen too much war. "Colonel Whitfield," he called out. "I'm Major Cassidy. An old minister flagged us down, said Union forces had you trapped here." Whitfield emerged from behind a pew, relief flooding through him. "Major, your timing is impeccable. We've been under siege since yesterday." Cassidy's eyes swept the chapel, taking in the rifles stacked near the pews, the defensive positions, the unconscious Captain Henderson. "I can see that. The Reverend said something about Yankees using his church to hide weapons?" "That's correct. We discovered a significant arsenal hidden in the pews. Union operation well organized." "Where are the Yankees now?" "Fled when they heard your approach. At least 7 of them, maybe more. They were preparing to burn the building." Cassidy's face darkened. "Burn a church. Animals." He turned to his sergeants. "Search the perimeter. I want prisoners if possible, but don't take risks in this darkness." As his men fanned out, Cassidy examined the hidden compartments in the pews. He let out a low whistle. "This is sophisticated work. The Yankees put real effort into this." "There's more," Whitfield said quietly. He led Cassidy to where he'd hidden the intelligence documents. "Maps, supply routes, defensive positions throughout Virginia. Someone's been feeding them detailed information." Cassidy's expression turned grim as he examined the papers. "This is a spy network, a substantial one." He looked at Whitfield with new respect. "You may have uncovered something significant here, Colonel. This intelligence alone could help us root out Union agents throughout the valley." "That was my thinking, though I admit I was beginning to wonder if we'd live long enough to report it." "Your sick officer, Henderson, is it? My medical orderly will see to him. We'll get him to a field hospital within hours." For the first time in 2 days, Whitfield felt the tension begin to ease. They'd survived. Henderson would get treatment. The intelligence would reach Confederate command. But something nagged at him. "Major, how did Reverend Hartwick know you were in the area?" Cassidy smiled slightly. "Pure chance. We were patrolling the valley roads when the old man rode up like the devil was chasing him. Said his church was under attack by Yankees, begged us to help." He paused. "Strange thing, though. He kept saying something about his son, about preserving what his son died for." Whitfield frowned. Something about that didn't sit right, but he was too exhausted to puzzle it out. Outside, hidden in the darkness, Captain Foster watched the Confederate cavalry secure the chapel. His careful plan had collapsed in minutes. The weapons were lost. The intelligence was lost. And worse, the Confederates now knew about the spy network that had taken months to build. "We need to pull back," Sergeant Cobb whispered. "Get word to our lines about what happened here." Foster nodded slowly. They'd lost this battle. But the war wasn't over. As dawn broke over the Shenandoah Valley, Confederate cavalry escorted Whitfield and his officers south toward their lines. Captain Henderson, though still feverish, was stable and being transported by wagon. The captured rifles and intelligence were secured, ready to be analyzed by Confederate command. Inside the now empty chapel, Reverend Hartwick stood alone in the silence. He'd saved the building from burning. He'd saved those Confederate officers from death. But in doing so, he'd betrayed the Union cause his son had died for. The old minister knelt before the altar and prayed for forgiveness, for wisdom, for an end to the war that was tearing everything apart. He'd thought he understood where his loyalties lay. Now he wasn't sure he understood anything at all. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. 3 weeks later, Colonel Marcus Whitfield stood in a Richmond office, facing General Robert E. Lee himself. The legendary commander studied the maps and documents spread across his desk, the intelligence recovered from St. Michael's Chapel. "You've done exceptional work, Colonel," Lee said in his quiet, measured voice. "This intelligence has already proven valuable. We've arrested 3 suspected Union agents in the valley. Supply routes have been rerouted. Defensive positions have been reinforced." "Thank you, sir," Whitfield replied. "Though I fear the Union will simply establish new networks. Undoubtedly, war is a continuous adaptation." Lee looked up, his gray eyes sharp. "But you've bought us time and potentially saved lives. That matters." After Whitfield was dismissed, he walked through Richmond's crowded streets, his mind troubled. They'd won that engagement at the chapel. They'd secured valuable intelligence. Captain Henderson was recovering. By any military measure, it had been a success. So why did he feel hollow? He thought of Reverend Hartwick, the old minister who'd saved them by summoning Confederate cavalry. Whitfield had learned since that Hartwick's son had died fighting for the Union. The Reverend had betrayed his own son's cause to save Confederate soldiers and preserve his church. What drove a man to such choices? What terrible calculus made such betrayals necessary? Whitfield had no answers. He only knew that this war was grinding everyone down, forcing impossible decisions, destroying certainties that once seemed unshakable. 50 miles north, Captain Daniel Foster submitted his report to Colonel Kane. The mission had been a complete failure. The weapons were lost. The intelligence network was compromised. Several agents had already been captured. "It was a well-executed operation," Kane said, trying to console him. "You couldn't have anticipated that Confederate cavalry patrol." "I should have," Foster replied bitterly. "I should have had better reconnaissance. I should have moved faster." "You did everything right. Sometimes the dice fall wrong." Kane closed the report. "But Foster, that minister, Hartwick, he betrayed his own side to save that building." "I know. His son died for the Union, died believing he was preserving the nation, and the father threw that away to save 6 Confederate officers and a church." Foster had thought about little else for 3 weeks. Maybe he saw something we don't. Maybe he understood that some things transcend sides. Or maybe he's just a coward, Kane said harshly. A man who couldn't bear to see his precious church burn, even for a cause his son died defending. Foster said nothing. He wasn't sure which interpretation was correct. He wasn't sure it mattered. The war would continue. More battles would be fought. More men would die. And people like Reverend Hartwick would keep making impossible choices, trying to preserve small pieces of sanity in an insane world. In the Shenandoah Valley, at St. Michael's Chapel, Samuel Hartwick conducted Sunday services for a sparse congregation. Many had stopped coming, some because they'd learned he'd harbored Union weapons, Others because they'd learned he'd betrayed that cause to the Confederates. He was trusted by neither side now. His church stood empty most days, a monument to the impossibility of neutrality in wartime. But he continued his duties. He preached about forgiveness, about mercy, about the hope of eventual reconciliation. Few listened. Fewer believed. One evening, as he locked the chapel doors, he noticed fresh scratches on the floorboards. Someone had been tampering with the pews again. He investigated and found that several compartments had been rebuilt, modified, prepared to hide something new. The old minister stood in the darkness, understanding what this meant. Both sides would continue to use his church. Both would continue to see it as a resource to be exploited. He could protest, could refuse, could try to maintain some kind of sanctity. But he knew it would make no difference. The chapel had become a battlefield, just like everything else. The war consumed everything it touched, even houses of God. He thought of his son Samuel, killed at Bull Run fighting for the Union. He thought of Colonel Whitfield and his officers, whom he'd saved from burning. He thought of Captain Foster and his men, who'd fled into the darkness. All of them were victims. All of them were perpetrators. The war made monsters of everyone, forcing choices that no one should have to make. Reverend Hartwick knelt in the darkness and prayed for an end to the killing. He prayed for his son. He prayed for all the sons, north and south, dying in muddy fields for causes they barely understood. And he prayed that when this war finally ended, if it ever ended, people would remember that not everything could be reduced to sides, that some things were worth preserving regardless of politics or strategy, that a church could be more than a hiding place for rifles, that mercy could be more powerful than victory. But as he prayed in the darkness, listening to rain begin to fall once more on the valley, he suspected his prayers would go unanswered. This war was too big, too consuming. It would burn itself out eventually, but only after destroying everything in its path. The chapel would survive, the building at least. Whether it would remain a sanctuary or simply become another casualty of war, another ruin in a landscape of ruins, remained to be seen. Outside, in the darkness, shadows moved through the trees. North or south, friend or foe, it was impossible to tell. The war continued, indifferent to individual suffering, grinding forward toward whatever terrible conclusion awaited. And in the chapel pews, hidden beneath carefully carved wood, empty compartments waited to be filled again. The game would continue. The war would go on. Some battles ended. The war never did.